Good afternoon, everyone. Today is, January 6th already? Tuesday? Wow. I hope everybody had a good weekend. And I don't know what everybody's weather's like today. It's really sunny here. It's kind of nice. We got a new addition to our family this morning, and maybe I will be able to show her off sometime during the stream. She's outside playing and getting to know our other little one. So, but yeah, so it's been quite the morning. Once again, I originally planned on going through Sheriff Micky Srines, ex-Sheriff Micky Srines from Kentucky, Letcher County, his deposition for the civil case. But once again, it's been trumped and over superseded by some new filings, a lot of new filings in the Karen Reed civil case. So today we're going to go over the Karen Reed filings, and then possibly later on tonight I'll record the Micky Srines deposition, because it's very interesting. They're trying to say that he was on the verge of some sort of mental or psychological breakdown in the days and possibly weeks leading up to the shooting of Judge Mullins. And in reading his deposition, because it's like 194 pages, and I don't want to go over 194 boring pages on the stream, so I'm trying to go through it and, cherry pick the interesting and the parts that stand out to me the most. And I'm telling you, I don't know how to say this without sounding judgmental, but is he a little slow? Or is this his mental break coming through? Because in this deposition, I'm telling you, it's like spoon feeding a baby animal. I mean, it's like a baby bird in your hand that's, on the verge of death. You have to like spoon feed it with an eyedropper or whatever. I am telling you what, this guy, for whatever reason, seems very either altered or confused or outside the norm. I don't know what his norm is, but I'm hoping it's a little more astute than what he's showing in this deposition, seeing as though he's been the sheriff since 2019. It would be irresponsible of them to let this man be a sheriff if this is how he is on the norm, because I'm telling you, I was shocked at some of the odd things that he said and his lack of understanding questions. I mean, basic questions he's having a hard time with. And it's like, and I don't think it's to be evasive. I really don't. He's just truly confused. He's not quite, it doesn't seem like he's all there, if you know what I mean. It just seems like he's out to lunch. And I don't know if this is his norm, and if it is, God help Letcher County. Um, but he won the election. That's how he became the sheriff. But you find out in this deposition that he didn't do any field training. He was a court officer for the years leading up to him becoming sheriff. He was elected sheriff as a court officer. He'd never been a road officer. He'd worked in the detention center, but as far as being a deputy sheriff on the road, nothing. He was quote unquote grandfathered in, which I didn't know you could do that as law enforcement. But I guess these small towns, they run things differently. I don't know. I would think that it would be the regulations and the training and the requirements for being a armed officer representing the law. I would think that you would need some sort of education with a criminal justice background, or at least I would think that you'd have to go through boot camp. You know, they have a boot camp for police officers? Yeah. So, and he apparently didn't go through any of that. So, and he only had a few hours of community college. Not even a semester or a quarter, a few hours. So, I am confused as to how they justify that. And so then, of course, you know, the new deputy sheriff's officers that were in hired and added on by him. Of course, they didn't get any of the annual training or like, you know, most people that work nowadays have to take some kind of ethics training every year. It's mandatory. I think it's pretty much no matter what line of work you're in. And he doesn't require his deputies to do that. He just hands them the policies and tells them, read up on them and become familiar with them, you know? And I just find that really weird. I don't know. So yeah. But anyway, we will get to that. Maybe I'll do that stream tonight and you'll see what I mean. There's no recording, there's no audio to it. It's just a deposition transcribed, the transcription of his deposition, but you can really get a gist of what's going on by reading it. You don't need to have audio. Oh shit. Okay, well, so much for that. Sorry. I didn't mean to scare everybody. Yeah, so let me see. There's a lot of background noise here today, so you'll have to excuse all that. Just 1 second, I'll be right back, okay? I'm sorry. I screwed up. So, I'll be right back. This is our new addition. I don't know if you guys can see her. Oh, come on, say hi. This is our new addition. I don't know what's wrong with my camera now. There we go. Her name is Keone. It means the goddess of snow. And she's a little border collie. But she's our newest addition. Can you say hi? Can you say hi? She's a little love bug. But she's had quite the day. She's gone through a car wash. She went to the pet store. And now she's trying to break in a big sister. So, yeah, she's say hi, Keone. But that's our newest little addition. It's hard to see her, but yeah, she's a cutie. She'd be content in my lap like this forever, which I guess we'll just leave her alone for a minute. So anyway, so yeah, the whole Micky Srines thing is bizarre, and we will get to that. I'll get to that tonight, and then post that so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm overreacting, but yeah. So we're gonna go over some of the Karen Read filings. Hi, I know. So she's perfectly content. I guess I'll just leave her here while we go through some of these filings till she's had enough. Well, I gotta reach over here. Isn't what I want. Okay. So the first filing is a joint motion to continue hearing on the Karen Read's motion to compel Michael Proctor to produce documents pursuant to subpoenas. I guess she's having a hard time getting these people to produce your belly's big. You've been eating too much. Your belly's huge. It's got to be uncomfortable. Okay, sorry. So, defendant Karen Read and third party Michael Proctor respectfully request that the court continue the hearing to Read's motion to compel Proctor to produce documents pursuant to subpoena. The court has scheduled a hearing on Read's motion along with other matters on January 6, 2026. However, counsel to Read and Proctor have continued to confer since Read filed the motion. Proctor has begun to produce documents and has represented that he has not withheld any documents responsive to Read's subpoena on any basis other than attorney-client or marital privilege. Therefore, Read and Proctor request. Read and Proctor request the court continue any hearing on the motion. Once Proctor completes his production, Read will decide whether to withdraw her motion. Wherefore, Read and Proctor respectfully request that the court continue the hearing on Read's motion, currently scheduled for January 6, 2026. And then it's signed by Read's lawyers and Proctor's lawyer. Proctor finally has a lawyer, apparently, which I guess is good. It took him a while to find one. I don't know if it's because he's no longer employed and can't pay for it, or if it's because nobody wants to represent a piece of shit like that. I would probably say that I don't think it's the latter, because lawyers, represent pieces of shit all the time. So let me put her down. I'll be right back. Okay, let go. Go play. Okay, I swore I would never get another dog that sheds, and now we not only have another dog that sheds, but she sheds white hair. So there's that. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. Um, okay, and that's the same thing. Um, okay, now we're going to go over it's the third party Michael Proctor's statement in support of the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office's opposition to defendant Karen Reed's motion to compel production of data. Now comes third party Michael Proctor and submits this memorandum in support of the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office's opposition to plaintiff's motion to compel data in response to the subpoena. Defendant Karen Reed's motion should be denied because it and the accompanying subpoena constitute nothing more than a fishing expedition of Proctor's personal cell phone. Commonwealth v. Lamb, 444 Mass 22 229. Quashing a subpoena where it constitutes nothing more than a fishing expedition, quote unquote. Moreover, Reed and her attorneys are already in possession of at least 38,707 pages of text messages from Proctor's personal cell phone. They're not saying 38,000 text messages. They're saying 38,707 pages of text messages. Holy crap. That's a lot of text messages. Trial testimony of Proctor, see also DA's office opposition. Reed's motion seeks, quote, previously disclosed and widely publicized text messages sent by Proctor, end quote, with an assumption that there are others. Well, you know, they didn't, in the criminal trial, they didn't really reveal that many text messages, just some pretty crappy ones. These 38,707 pages were upon information and belief subpoenaed by a federal grand jury pursuant to the investigation into the Massachusetts State Police involvement into the criminal investigation and prosecution of defendant Reed, and included Proctor's personal text messages sent both before and well after the state grand jury's June 9th, 2022 indictment of Miss Reed on second-degree murder charges. So let's go down to footnote 1. Upon information and belief, no indictments arose out of that grand jury investigation, and Proctor was never found by the grand jury to have acted with bias or prejudice during his criminal investigation of Reed. Okay. So he calls all criminal suspects cunt and whatnot. I don't think so. Importantly, the contents of Proctor's cell phone are currently under December 10th, 2025 protective order in the criminal case of Commonwealth v. Miles King, Norfolk Superior Court docket number, and it gives the docket number. Accordingly, to the extent that Reed alleges that Proctor's cell phone contains information that shows him his bias or prejudice in pursuing a criminal investigation against her, such messages, if they ever existed, have most certainly been produced during the criminal proceedings against Reed. And again, I say no, they weren't. There was no way there was anywhere near 38,000 pages of text messages released during that criminal trial. Argument, Roman numeral 1. Reed's request seeks documents that overly broad in time and that doesn't make sense. Reed's request seeks documents that are overly broad in time and scope. Seeks documents that are privileged and seeks documents that are not likely to lead to the admissibility of admissible information. As pointed out in the DA's office opposition, Reed's subpoena, quote, seeks texts, chats, audio files, pictures, and videos that span many years and in some instances predate Proctor's employment as a trooper, which began in 2013. Just one second. Accordingly, the subpoenas on its face is grossly overbroad in time and scope. Moreover, as also noted by the DA's office, Reed's subpoena seeks documents protected as attorney-client communications and documents protected by the spousal privilege. To be sure, all of these communications are privileged and not subject to disclosure. Footnote 2. To the extent Reed asserts that Proctor and his attorneys should be forced to review the data for these privileges, such a request is overly broad and unduly burdensome. Okay. Furthermore, as a non-party to this litigation, Proctor has an expectation of privacy in the information contained within the electronically stored data. The Supreme Judicial Court has previously held that all persons have privacy rights in response to documents and information sought by subpoena, and the court has cautioned trial judges that, quote, the existence of a personal interest in non-disclosure of documents might well persuade a court against ordering production of documents, end quote. Finding that upon remand to the trial court, a witness's, quote, privacy interest might become a factor, end quote, in whether the witness should be required to produce documents, as the production might, quote unquote, possibly expose personal relationships of no concern to congressional legitimate investigation. This too is such a case where this honorable court should prevent disclosure, especially in light of the fact that Reed already has 38,707 relevant texts. Well, they didn't say 3,707 relative texts. They said pages of texts. So which is it? Is it texts? Oops, sorry. Texts or 38,000 pages of texts? Undersigned counsel have not seen the scores of thousands of documents /text /emails /messages and other items contained within the electronically stored data. Whereas the data contains data going back more than 15 years or 13 years, it is likely to be more than 100,000 items. It is likely to contain photos and communications of and with not only with Proctor's wife and attorneys, but also his children, his family members, parents, friends, and others that have zero interest or relationship to this matter. Well, I say to you that why are you worried about his friends being shown, unless the friends are the House defendants? Additionally, the data may contain sensitive, privileged information regarding other criminal investigations and may jeopardize the scope of those investigations. Can I just say Shit. Can I just say that that is such hogwash? Because if he was that worried about the integrity of his investigations, then he wouldn't share undisclosed details with his friends in text messages about said cases. You know, the fact that he is so open and he shared information about Karen Reed's case with his friends from school in that chat group tells me that it wasn't the first time. He did it too easily, and it just came too easy to him. So that wasn't the first time he's done that. And now he wants to play like, oh, that, I have too much integrity to disclose any information about my criminal investigations. I'm not buying it. I'm sorry. He's lost my support in that big time. I mean, it is what it is, but he did it to himself. Can I just remind everybody of that? Okay. Additionally, the data may contain sensitive, privileged information regarding other criminal investigations and may jeopardize the scope of those investigations. Moreover, it may contain confidential, privileged data, medical information that is protected by, and it gives the statute, which limit the availability of medical and hospital records as well other state and federal laws. You mean like somebody's medical history, let's say, who may have a certain GI type medical background? You mean someone like that? You mean releasing private HIPAA information, HIPAA protected information, kind of like that, like a leaky balloon knot and whatnot? Is that what we're talking about? Because when did you become so moral, about that? Because we all know what you said about Karen Reed and her medical history, and you had no problem, no hesitation doing that. So there's that. What a piece of crap. To allow defendant Reed unfettered access to this data on such an unfounded basis that discoverable information, quote unquote, might exist constitutes an unwarranted invasion of privacy. Wherefore, Michael Proctor respectfully requests that defendant Reed's motion to compel be denied. So, moving right along. Keone. I'm going to call her Canoni so bad because it sounds so much like Canoni. Keone, let me see. There's a lot of background noise. I apologize. Order regarding motions to continue hearings on motions to compel. Might as well just look at all of them, right? Okay, no, that's not worth it. I know there's more than this. We might get to go into the whole ex-Sheriff Stines deposition if this is all that I'm finding. That might be it. I think we covered the other stuff last time I did a Karen Reed. Um, um, yeah, because we covered this stuff already. Yeah, we looked at all that other stuff already. So we might be done with hers today. That because I did all the other ones already. Well, that was easy enough. Um, okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to Micky Srines' deposition. This is the United States District Court, Eastern District of Kentucky, Pikeville Division, Civil Action. Sabrina Atkins as the plaintiff. And this is it's a deposition of Micky Srines, but it also lists Ben Fields as a defendant. So this was taken on September 16th, 2024. Sabrina Atkins is one of the ladies who was on house arrest and who was more or less forced to exchange sexual acts for in order to be on house arrest because she could not afford the GPS bracelet and she didn't want to go back to jail. So Deputy Sheriff Ben Fields gave her the opportunity to be out on house arrest with the bracelet and not pay for it. And the way he did that was by making her perform sexual favors for him in Judge Mullen's chambers, mind you. And so this is Micky, and she has also sued Micky Srines because she says that Micky Srines, as the sheriff, knew what was going on and failed to do anything about it. So, okay. Okay, let's just start from the beginning, and we won't read it all word for word, but I just kind of want to give you the gist of how they started his deposition. The Miss Baxter, who represents, I believe, the plaintiff. No. Oh yeah, yes. She represents the plaintiff. Sheriff Stines, my name is Bethany Baxter. I represent Sabrina Atkins and the estate of Jennifer Hill in this case, and I'm going to be taking your deposition today. So my first question for you, have you ever given a deposition before? His answer, years ago in a car wreck case, I believe, 20 years ago. Okay, that is the only other occasion? Yes, ma'am. I'm just going to talk about some ground rules. As you know, you are under oath. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. As the day goes on, sometimes my questions get longer and maybe a little harder to understand. Don't be shy about asking me to rephrase something or repeat something. I am happy to do that. If you don't ask me to rephrase or repeat a question, I'm going to assume that you understood my question and that your answer is responsive to my question. Is that fair? Yes. I'm happy to take breaks today and so forth if you want to talk to your attorney or go to the bathroom or whatever you want to do. My only request is that if I have asked you a question, I would ask that you respond to that question before we take the break, okay? And he says, okay. The other thing that I will say is we have got a court reporter here who is taking down everything that is being said. So I'm going to ask you to try to make verbal responses instead of shaking your head or or because that gets confusing when we come back to read the record down the line. Okay? Yes. Then she asked him, "What did you do to prepare for your deposition today?" And Mr. Shaw is one of Micky Stein's lawyers. He says, "She doesn't want to know about any conversations you had with me or with your personal attorney." And I find that odd that he felt the need to speak up and say that right off the bat. He didn't even give Micky Stein a chance to answer the question. Okay, and this is Micky Stein's answer. "Okay, so I looked over Sabrina Atkins' deposition. I attended Ben Fields and Patty Stockham's. You read Patty Stockham's deposition?" And he says yes. And then he says he read the interrogatories that he produced in this case. And when she asks him the interrogatories that you produced in this case, Mr. Shaw again speaks up and says, "We are not for sure whose. He looked at some written discovery in the process." So I find it odd that Mr. Shaw is being so overly protective of Micky Srines. You know, I think that's weird. But we will move on. Okay, where were you? She asked him where he was born, and I find this funny. "Where were you born and raised?" "Born in Whitesburg, Kentucky." And she said, "In town," and he says, "At the hospital." So it's like, okay, you know what I mean? It's questions like that make me wonder what is going on with this guy. Is he really that out of it? And because this was, when did I say this was? This was September 16th, was it? Of 2024. And he didn't shoot Judge Mullins till later on in 2025. So it wasn't, this is like a couple months before the shooting. And they're trying to say that he was showing signs of some kind of mental break days, maybe weeks leading up to the shooting. And I'm reading this thinking maybe you guys are all wrong, you know? Where'd you grow up? "I grew up in Fleming Neon." "Okay, I don't think that I asked you. Will you state your full name for the record, your legal name?" And then he states his name. "So when you were brought home from the hospital, they took you back to Fleming Neon?" "Yes." "And how long did you live in Fleming?" 19 years. "Then where did you move after you left Fleming?" "McRoberts." "Did you move there with your parents or did you move there by yourself?" "My wife." "So you got married at 19 years old?" "Actually, when we moved there, we wasn't married." Um, uh, okay, then the lawyer says, "So I know you just said your spouse's maiden name. Any other surnames of folks in your family in Fletcher County aside from Stines or Gibson?" And he answers, "I am not really sure what you are asking. Last names is what I mean by that. Like, what was your mother's maiden name?" "Stines." "What was your father's last name?" "I don't know who my biological dad is." "Okay, fair. So did you go to college?" "Southeast Community." "There in Whitesburg?" "Yes." "Okay, did you graduate from Fleming Neon High School?" "Yes." "What did you study at Southeast?" "Just basics. I only got 26 hours." "Okay, and were you going to school full time?" "Yes, and I had a job." Um, okay. He worked at the BP for a little while. "Okay, and what about after that?" "I went to the Fleming Neon Police Department." So he went from a gas station attendant to working for the police department. And so I thought, well, he must have been working in dispatch or something. There's no way he was a police officer, right? He was. He was a police officer. "Okay, what did you start with the Fleming Neon Police? What did you start? What year did you start with the Fleming Neon Police Department?" 2001, I believe." "How long did you work at the Fleming Police Department?" 7 months. "Why did you leave that job?" "Cutbacks." "What was your position with the Fleming Neon Police Department?" "I was a patrol officer." Okay. That's kind of scary. Um, so what did you do after that? I drew unemployment. And what about after that? And he said, I went to work for the sheriff's office. Okay. So that was 2002. Was the training that you received as a deputy sheriff different from the training that you received as a patrol officer? Because they're assuming that he got training as for before he became a patrol officer. Well, don't ever assume. Okay, so he says, and I guess he didn't answer right away. So they said, "Do you want me to repeat the question?" And he said, "Yeah." And then Mr. Shaw again pipes up and says, "Are you talking about did he go to the academy twice?" And Miss Baxter says, "Do you have to go to the academy as a police officer?" And he says, "Yes." And so that the same academy you would go to as a new deputy sheriff. And then he says, "Let's talk," to his attorney. And his attorney says, "Yeah, let's." So they took a break. They come back. I think the last question that I had was the academy training that you received as a patrol officer, the same as the academy training that you would have received as the Letcher County Sheriff's deputy. And he answered, "When I was policing at Neon, I got laid off because of money. They couldn't send me to the academy, so I actually never attended." Well, you got laid off because of funds. But when you were hired, they wouldn't have hired you if they had money problems and if they were lacking in funds. So why didn't they send you to the police academy when they hired you? That's my question. Okay, so did you attend the academy in 2002 when you went to work for the Letcher County Sheriff's Office? Mr. Shaw speaks up again. That was the point of confusion. There are different types of academy training. I don't think there's anything confusing about these questions. Miss Baxter, that is what I'm trying to figure out. Mr. Shaw, he went to the academy, but not, and then he doesn't finish his question. Let me explain his academy training. And then she says, let's let him testify for himself. I agree. So the deputy sheriff has an academy that is 20 weeks long. Court security officers have an academy that is 2 weeks long. And you have different types of training for both. She's not asking you about the difference between a deputy sheriff and a court security officer. She's asking you the difference between a deputy sheriff for Letcher County and a Neon Police Department officer. Two totally different things. So when I was initially hired for Stephen Banks, they put me through pre-pops, and I was about to work the road and work the court and stuff. Okay, so did both the deputy training so you did both the deputy training and the CSO training? He answers, I have never attended the academy. That is what you first asked when I first with. You have got a year to attend. Okay. Just 1 second. Am I not sharing my... Fuck. I'm not sharing my stream. Just 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. Um, then he says, after that, I worked for Stephen Banks for 7 months. Danny Webb came in. I worked the road and court for Danny. And mind you, he still hasn't gone to the police, to the sheriff's academy or the deputy sheriff's academy, right? But now he's working the road and court. During that time, Danny comes to me and says, do you want to be a road officer or a court officer? And I said, I will be a court security. Just 1 second. And he said, we can get you grandfathered in. And I had to take all of their steps to be a court security officer. So again, he's getting out of going to training camp, the boot camp. Question. I just want to make sure that I understand. So 2002 is when you first went to work for the Letcher County Sheriff's Office. Yes. Why don't you just tell me what training you did when you first came on board? And he says, when I originally went for Neon, I had to take all of the pre-pops. That is the fitness. And Miss Baxter, sorry, we didn't turn the audio back on. Okay, whatever. And then she says, pre-pops? Okay. And he says, once you do that, you can take the other training at the academy. And then Neon laid me off. And I didn't get to go to that one. She says, okay. That makes sense. So did you end up doing that training after you went to Letcher County Sheriff's Office? And he says, not the full 20-week academy. No, ma'am. She says, why not? The position that they put me in, the state didn't require me to attend that. And what was that position? Court security officer. Okay. So somehow he finagled his way out of going to any of the training boot camps throughout his whole career as a deputy. Because he says that he worked the road and court security. See, and yet he's telling the lawyer that the reason why I didn't go through the training academy is because he was just a court officer. Well, he wasn't. He worked on the road also. Then the judge asks him, do you want to go to the academy? And I said, no, I'm going to stay in court. And he said, okay. It sounds to me like he's trying to get out of going to the training academy for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe he's just lazy. Anyway, okay, do you have to do the 20 weeks of deputy training to work the road? And then he says, can we talk? Again to his attorney. So I don't know. I mean, it's just weird. These aren't hard questions. Mr. Shaw then speaks up and says, just for the record, he and I don't know how long ago it was. He suffers from California encephalitis. So when he is under stress, sometimes it causes some issue. And Miss Baxter says, I've never heard of that. And it's something that you get from tick bites, basically. So here's where that first rears its head, is during his deposition. And they're going to try, I think they're going to try and work that into his criminal case also. Well, if we need to take more breaks, I will be happy to do that. Okay, so let's move on. Then she again asks him, did you get the training after that? And after that, you became sheriff. And he says no. So he's become sheriff now, and he still hasn't gotten any kind of training, officer training. He's never gone to the academy. Um, then they ask, what was the time period you were working as deputy sheriff? And Mr. Shaw again speaks up and says, and you mean court security officer, right? Letcher County Sheriff's Deputy Court Security Officer. You said that you started in 2003, correct? No, 2002. Okay. Was that until you became sheriff? Yes, that was. I took over in 2019. The election was in 2018. Okay, so what else? She asks, have you ever been named as a defendant in litigation? And he says yes. And she asks, was that the car accident case that you referenced earlier? And he said, I believe that I was just a witness in that. Okay, well, what was the litigation where you were named as a defendant? And he says, it would have been, and then Mr. Shaw interrupts and answers for him, Congleton. And Micky Srines says, yes. So it's like, why is Micky Srines' attorney answering for him? I don't get this. It's just so weird. And she says, what was the name? And he says, Alicia Congleton. And did she work for the sheriff's office? He says, yes. Then she asks, have you ever been responsible for investigating sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, or discrimination in any position that you have held? Mr. Shaw again speaks up and says, have you? Or we can talk for a second if you want to. And I do believe that before she started, Miss Baxter said that if you ask for a break, I would prefer that you answer, if there's an outstanding question, I would prefer that you answer the outstanding question before you take the break. I'm more than happy to give you a break so that you can confer with your attorney or whatever. But if a question has already been asked before you ask for a break, can you please just answer that question and then go on the break? And he agreed to that, but here they're not doing that. And I don't understand why this lawyer of Micky Srines is so involved in the questioning. It's weird. And Micky Srines goes ahead and answers and says, I'm not understanding her question. Now, that was a pretty straightforward question. Have you ever been responsible for investigating sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, or other discrimination in any position that you have held? You can't get much more straightforward than that. And he says, I'm not understanding her question. So she says, think of all the jobs that you have had in your lifetime, including your job as sheriff. Have part of the duties of any of those jobs been to investigate sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, or sex discrimination? And Mr. Shaw speaks up again. I think that she is including this case too. What happened when you received work about this case? And he answers, okay. And then Mr. Shaw again speaks up and says, have you had other incidents of allegations? And Miss Baxter finally speaks up and says, if you have questions, I would rather rephrase the question. I know you are trying to be helpful, Jonathan. She's speaking to Mr. Shaw. Do you understand the question? And Micky Srines says, no, not really. Okay, let's start here. Have you ever, in your capacity as sheriff, have you ever investigated a complaint of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct? Just one second. It's like having a 2-year-old. Oh my God. And Mr. Shaw speaks up again and says, do you mean him individually? Has he investigated? They're making this so much harder than it is. And she says, has he, as sheriff, ever investigated sexual harassment or sexual misconduct? Answer, can we talk a second? I'm not, and he doesn't finish his sentence, because Mr. Shaw says, yeah. So they take another break. Mr. Shaw comes back and says, for clarification, I think that I understand what you are saying. Are you talking about internal allegations within the department, or are you talking about somebody from the street coming in and saying my daddy is sexually abusing me? And Miss Baxter says, I'm talking about in your role as sheriff related to employment, employees, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. Does that make sense? And he says, yes. And she said, so have you ever been responsible for conducting such an investigation? And he finally says, this is the only one. And then he says, I immediately reported it, took action, reported it to the state police. They declined. And I talked to the Commonwealth attorney, the county attorney. And she said, I will ask you more about that later. And then Mr. Williams, never mind. Then she says, I think I heard you say that you have never investigated sexual harassment or misconduct aside from employee Benfield's. Is that correct? And Mr. Shaw says, objection. He said that he referred that to KSP, Kentucky State Police. Okay, let's ask it this way. Are the allegations about Benfield's the only time that you have ever been made aware of an allegation of sexual misconduct by a sheriff's office employee? Mr. Shaw speaks up again. Since he's been sheriff? And she says, correct. Then his other attorney speaks up and says, I'm not sure that I understand the question, and I know that that's why he is hesitating not to answer. And then she says, you became aware at some point that Benfield's had been accused of sexual misconduct while he was a Letcher County Sheriff's deputy, correct? And he says, yes. Then she says, has there ever been some other instance while you were sheriff that you became aware of a similar allegation related to some other employee? Mr. Shaw speaks up again. That is employed by you? I think you prefaced it to the best of your recollection. And then she says, that is all that I can ask to the best of your recollection. Mr. Shaw says, if you recall something, tell her. And if you don't, then you don't recall. Then Micky Srines says, yeah, to the best of my knowledge, I don't recall. She asks him, have you ever been disciplined by an employer? And he says, yes. And she said, and who was that? He said, Sheriff Webb, for not shaving. Okay. Just 16 years, yes. There's a lot of background noise, and I apologize because people keep making noise in here. Okay. Then Miss Baxter says, okay, I guess, as far as persons on home incarceration, was it your responsibility to make sure that they abided by the court order relating to the terms of that home incarceration? Micky Srines says, what was your question again? I mean, he's just so out of it. It doesn't make any sense. Just one second. Let me see. Um, Then she asks, okay, anything else that kind of would dictate the terms of someone's home incarceration aside from the statute and the judge's order? And Mr. Shaw speaks up again and he says, do you know the answer? Micky Srines says, I didn't do a lot of them, but judges do verbal. What do you mean by judges do verbal? Mr. Shaw again speaks up. Do you want to give her an example? I don't understand why Mr. Shaw is so protective over Micky Srines. What does he think he's going to... It's like he's afraid he's going to say something that he doesn't want him to say. So when I have violation, I would report it to the judge, and at times they would say, put them in jail, and I would call down to the jail. Okay, and would you be the one to transport that person to jail? A lot of mine was at the courthouse. And then she says, do you remember signing any kind of employment contract with EKCS related to your employment with them? And Micky Srines again says, what was the question again? I mean, these are easy questions. I don't understand what the problem is. Why is he not hearing or understanding these questions? It just doesn't make sense. So that's what makes me think that there was something going on even before they suspect it was going on. Then she says, okay, what about collecting fees? Would you ever collect fees from folks at the same time as you were working as a bailiff in district court? And he says, can I ask you a question? And she says, I would rather that you answer my question, and if you don't recall, that is fine too. Was there ever a time that you can recall when you were working as bailiff in district court and would have collected fees, during that time period when you were working as a bailiff? Mr. Dotson, counsel, do you mean during the day or do you mean the same month? I mean, what kind of question is that? That doesn't even make sense. Before 4:30, she says. And he says if they was in court and just the way he talks is, you can tell he's not very educated. It's just hard to believe that this man was elected sheriff. It just goes to show you who you know, I think. If they was in court and the judge did an arraignment and they were on house arrest and the judge said pretrial in a month and that was a Wednesday and they said, Mickey, I have got the money, I would say, hand it here. Yeah, and I would go ahead and take it. Um, 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 then she asks, I think that you referenced earlier that there was I don't know. a 2-week training that you got as part of that CSO position. And he says, no, there's a 2-week that you get to that. I was grandfathered in where that I started so many years. When you started working as police and CSO, you could get grandfathered in if you started years before the state required that. So you're saying at the time that you became a CSO, the state didn't even have any kind of training for that position? And he says, no. And she says, do you recall when that training went into effect? And he says, no. What about Letcher County Sheriff's Office policies? Do you recall any training about policies specific to Letcher County Sheriff's Department? And he says, can I ask a question? Reminds me of a little kid that wants to get out of answering a question he doesn't know the answer to. So Mr. Shaw speaks up again and says, oh God, says when? Before he was sheriff, after he was, or after he was sheriff? And she says, I mean, once you became sheriff, it was your responsibility to enforce policies. And he said, yes. And I'm talking about before, when you were a deputy, do you recall any training about Letcher County Sheriff's Department policies? And he says, yes, we received a policy manual. And she said, what would the training consist of? I don't know detail by detail, but I generalized myself with the policy book. Um, Then she says, would there have ever been an instance that you would have driven the sheriff's department vehicle out to retrieve one of these home incarceration devices? And he says, yes. And what she's trying to get at is these two jobs have nothing to do with each other. So when he's getting paid by the sheriff's office, he should not be doing work for the home incarceration company and vice versa. And the fact that he is I'm sure against the law. If nothing else, it's against policy. Were there any policies about how you were or were not supposed to use sheriff department property? And he says, can I ask you a question? And Mr. Shaw says yes, and another break was taken. And then Mr. Shaw comes back and says, can we get some clarification on time frames when you are talking about? And she says, yeah, when you were deputy sheriff, were there any policies on how deputy sheriffs were or were not supposed to use sheriff's department equipment, meaning the car? And he says, policy changes all the time, but at times, yes. And she says, why would that policy change all of the time? I just said policies would change all of the time. She says, well, do you remember there being a policy when you were deputy sheriff? And he says, yes, I do believe there was a policy. Do you recall what that policy was? And he says, we can't. And then Mr. Shaw again interrupts and says, just tell her. Well, he was beginning to. And then you interrupted him. He says, can you ask the question again? And she says, the policy regarding sheriff's department equipment and property that you recall, what do you recall that policy being? And Mr. Shaw says again, at the time that he was deputy, not since he's been sheriff. And she says, yes, exactly. And he said, Micky Srines says, yeah, you can't use department stuff to do other jobs. And she says, right. And so you talked a little bit about your work with EKCS. You were also security guard at the hospital, right? And he says, yes. And then she talks about the uniforms they wore for the hospital job. Don't you need approval to work there? And she says, did you get any kind of approval from Sheriff Webb to perform that work? And he says, yes. And she says, was that approval documented anywhere? And he says, can I have a break? Just really weird. And she says, sure. it's going to be a long day. So another break was taken. And she says, okay, we were talking about your work as a security guard at the hospital, and you testified that there was only a verbal approval from Sheriff Webb for you to perform that service. Yes. Did you use any Letcher County Sheriff's Department equipment or property in performing that job? And he says yes. And she said, what did you use? Gun, duty belt, and a cruiser at times. It's just bizarre. Then he says there was multiple shifts at the hospital. It was all, and she said, years. How many years did you do that job? And he says, I can't remember. Okay, more than 1 year? Yes. Why did you decide to run for sheriff? It has been my lifelong dream, even as a kid, to the sheriff. And she said, to be a sheriff? And he says, yeah, my mama and mother told me when I was a kid that I talked about being a sheriff. So before you became sheriff, I guess after you won the election and before you became sheriff, did you make a decision to hire Ben Fields? And he says Ben Fields was hired by Sheriff Webb. He says he gave Ben Fields a recommendation. Then she said, did any other deputy sheriffs leave the sheriff's department at the same time that Sheriff Webb left? And he says, restate the question, please. I mean, just weird shit. What are you barking at? Then I have my other dog in here. She knows how to let herself in through the back door, so she's showing off. It's funny. Let's see. She says, did you recommend Billy Jones? And he says, you got me kind of, she has me kind of confused on you are talking. I don't know if Sheriff Webb hired Billy Jones. Just, I mean, is that how he always talks? I mean, because it looks pretty bad to have a sheriff who speaks like that. I've got to tell you. And I don't mean to sound rude or judgmental, but he's in a public position. So he should be able to speak a little better than that. And then she says, you got elected and you are about to become sheriff. I'm wondering what all you did to ready yourself for that position. You have talked about going to a state-required training. And he says, yes. Anything else that you did? And he said, yeah, I come over and kind of shadowed Sheriff Webb a little bit. And that's all he did. He shadowed the current sheriff. And she says, what about any efforts when you became a sheriff to review or revise any of the Letcher County Sheriff's Department's policies? And he says, can you ask that again? She said, did you review or revise any of the Letcher County Sheriff's Department's policies at the time that you became sheriff? And he says, yes, I familiarized myself with the policies. Yes, all of them. And I have through the years. Then she says, do you remember revising any of them? And he says, policy changes, so I don't know. As soon as I took over, is that what you're asking? I mean, just, it's insane the way he talks. I don't know. So let's read on. It says prior to recommending Ben Fields to Sheriff Webb, had Ben Fields ever been to your house before? He says, I don't recall. And she says, okay, I understand that you have maybe a weekly poker party. And he says, I wouldn't refer to it as a poker party. Well, what would you refer to it as? It is a gathering of friends and individuals, you know. We played rook there. We played cornhole there. We have had fish fries there. We fed the whole community. My neighbors' wives have come up and played rook, and we gather outside around the fire pit. It is just not poker all the time, is what I'm getting at. I mean, I don't know, it's just weird. Okay, after Deputy Fields became a deputy sheriff, did you invite him to some of those parties? And he says yes. Okay. We're talking about the and she asks, do you recall seeing in Mr. Fields' employment history an admission by him that on at least one occasion that he consumed alcoholic beverages while at work at the jail? Do you recall seeing that? He says, I don't recall. Then she says, within those documents that you produced, do you recall seeing an admission by Mr. Fields that while he was employed at the Letcher County Jail, he engaged in sexual contact during work hours at the detention center? And he says, no, I don't recall that. And these are documents that he actually handed over, and he doesn't know what they say. If you had seen that, would you have considered those to be red flags? And then he answers, it doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even answer the question. It says, that examination, that report that they send in, they recommend suitable. And she says, who is they? And he says, it is DOCJT, I believe. And then she said, I was just wondering, had you seen that information that he had consumed alcoholic beverages and he had engaged in sexual contact during work hours at the detention center? Had you known that, would you consider that as red flags in hiring Ben Fields? And he says, they send a report saying that they are suitable for the job. I have got reports that they say that says is not suitable for the job. So I took that as the state recommendation that he passed their exam. And she says, I understand that, but that is not my question. My question is, had you known that he had consumed alcoholic beverages while at work and engaged in sexual contact during work hours at the detention center, would you have considered those red flags in hiring Ben Fields? That is my question. And he says, yeah, I would not condone that type of activity on the job. And she says, but your testimony is that you weren't aware of that. Is that correct? Until today? And he said, ask it again. Have you ever heard anyone say that Ben Fields? Oh, no, absolutely not. And then he says, that wasn't your question to me earlier. Well, if you, never mind. It sounds like me. doesn't. Okay. Okay, then it says that he was given a form to sign saying that he received a policy manual. And Ben Fields signed it, but that was some 15 months after he started working for the Letcher County Sheriff's Office. Then she says, so why did you wait so long, over a year, to give him a copy of this policy manual? And he says, can I ask you a question? And she says, just answer the question. Then Mr. Shaw speaks up again and says, he wasn't the sheriff that hired him, so it is not his responsibility to give him the policy. This is all that I saw in the file. I don't know if Sheriff Webb gave him one or not. He should have. Okay, the only thing that I saw in the file as far as him having received a copy was dated April 13th. Mr. Shaw speaks up again and says, tell her you don't know. I mean, this Mr. Shaw just interjects himself everywhere. It's crazy. It's like he's afraid of what Micky Srines is going to say, so he cuts him off. It's bizarre to me. Then she says, I guess, were you aware, as prior to February of 2022, were you aware of Ben Fields performing services for EKCS while he was in the courtroom and during a period of time when he was working as bailiff? And he says, I don't understand your question. And then she repeats it, prior to February 2022, when you terminated Mr. Fields, Were you aware that there were times when he would perform services for East Kentucky Correctional Solutions while he was also in the courtroom and working as bailiff? And Stein says, one more time, sorry, I'm a little confused on your question. I'm not trying to be difficult. I mean, just bizarre. Then she says, were you aware that Fields performed services for EKCS while wearing a Letcher County Sheriff's deputy uniform? And Mr. Shaw interjects himself again and says, if you know, I mean. And he says, ask your question one more time. Sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult. You bounce around a little bit for me. Like I said, a little bit of stress. I mean, I don't know. It's just weird. Then she says, you don't recall being aware of that? If Ben Fields was wearing a Letcher County Sheriff's Department deputy uniform while performing services for EKCS, would that have been a violation of the Letcher County Sheriff's Department policies? And he says, I need clarification. I mean, you can't get any more clear than these questions are being asked. Then she says, okay, if Ben Fields was working someone up on an ankle monitor, doing something that was within his duties for EKCS while wearing a Letcher County Sheriff's deputy uniform, would that have been a violation of the Letcher County Sheriff's Department policies, yes or no? He says, I mean, when is he doing that? I don't get your question. It would be so frustrating working with somebody like this, I'm telling you. Um, let me see. Then they get in a little bit of a beef here. It says, okay, so to your knowledge, the only time that he would have been performing services for EKCS in his deputy sheriff uniform would be if he was at the courthouse. Is that correct? And Mr. Shaw intercedes again and says, and after work hours. And she says, well, I didn't hear him say that yet. And Mr. Shaw says, yeah, he did. And she says, he talked about himself doing that with Sheriff Webb, but I didn't hear him say that he allowed Fields to do that. And Mr. Shaw says, you are trying to confuse the witness. I don't think you can confuse him any more than he seems confused already. And she says, I'm not. I truly am not. I'm trying to get a straight answer. And then Micky Srines says, well, you have got me confused because I don't know what you are asking me. It's just, I don't know. It's crazy. And then she says, Deputy Sheriff Fields, he is wearing his deputy sheriff uniform. I think I understood you to say that he is allowed to wear that uniform and perform services for EKCS if he is at the courthouse. Is that correct? And Mr. Shaw, not Micky Srines, but Mr. Shaw says no. And Miss Baxter says, you are not testifying. He is testifying. Mr. Shaw says, quit trying to confuse the witness. And she says, I'm not. He told you what the practice was, Mr. Shaw says. And she says, no, he hasn't. And Mr. Shaw says, yes, he has. And Miss Baxter, well, I'm confused now then. And Mr. Shaw says, what the practice is, and did the practice change after you became sheriff? And this Stein says, you have got me confused. I don't know what she is asking. And then his other attorney says, she's asking you, is it okay for Ben to wear that uniform and hook somebody up on an ankle bracelet? And Mr. Shaw says, at the courthouse? So Mr. Shaw's just as bad as Micky Srines. And then she says, is that okay? And Micky Srines says, when? And she says, at the courthouse, any time of day. Mr. Shaw again answers, before work hours or after. I mean, what the fuck? It's like, come on, people. He says, see, when I come out at midnight or on the weekends, I was in plain clothes. But when I just got out of court, and she said, so you are saying it matters what time of day? And then his other attorney speaks up and says, she's not asking you what you did. She's asking you what the policy was to Ben Fields. And Mr. Shaw answers instead again, what would you allow Ben to do? And he says, I can't allow him to wear the uniform when he is out working for house arrest at any time. Just going around and stuff. I don't know what you're asking. This whole thing is crazy. I will be right back. Okay, so obviously that was a longer break than what I was planning, but it'll all get edited out. So it is now Thursday or Wednesday, January 7th, and it has been quite the night. Our new little addition, Keone, has been throwing up since last night. Now she's got the dry heaves, and it's to the point where as soon as she drinks something, she's dry heaving. So we have an appointment with the doctor today at 5, and to me that's far too long to wait, but that was the soonest they could get her in. So I'm really kind of nervous. She's sleeping right now finally, so I'm trying to be a little quieter than I normally would be. But yeah, so prayers to Keone. That name, by the way, means goddess of snow. So that's why we chose that name for her. My husband was up with her all night. And so she's finally sleeping, which is much needed. She was up, like I said, she was up all night throwing up. So, yeah, the poor baby. We just bought her yesterday. So, she's a border collie, full blooded. The dog that we currently have, she is a full blooded Australian Shepherd. And so she's having a hard time getting used to her, but she's concerned about her too. So that's a good sign. And she's just such a little peanut that it's like, breaks my heart. So anyway, let's get back to what we were covering, and that is the ex-sheriff Micky Srines' deposition in the civil case that he was also a defendant in. Sabrina Adkins brought charges or sued Ben Fields, the deputy sheriff who was actually ultimately sentenced for these crimes, and Micky Srines, the sheriff, who she says should have been aware of what was going on, and apparently they have proof that he was aware, and other organizations were also stated as defendants in this case. So anyway, I was talking about how off he seems in this deposition. He seems very aloof, very confused, very bewildered, like he's not all there. So I'm thinking, was he showing signs as soon as September that there was something going on psychologically or mentally? Because they're saying that he was showing signs a week, days prior to the shooting. And I'm reading this thinking, they're off. If this isn't his norm, then he was showing signs a lot earlier than that. And why nobody caught it, I don't know. So, so let's continue. So then Miss Baxter asks him, okay, what about these situations where deputy sheriffs have outside secondary employment? Were there any rules about when Ben Fields was or was not allowed to use the deputy sheriff vehicle to perform services for EKCS? Pretty straightforward question, right? Micky Srines' answer, ask me one more time. Sorry. And this is like been going on through the whole deposition. It's pretty straightforward questions, and he's not comprehending them. Now, I don't know if that's his norm or what, but if it's not, then yeah, then it went without being noticed. Um, 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 then she asked him, was there any instance when Ben Fields was working as a sheriff's deputy that you told him that he wasn't allowed to use that vehicle or any sheriff's equipment in relation to his job at EKCS? And he says, sorry. I mean, these are straightforward questions. Can you recall any time that you told Ben Fields, slow down a little bit, he says. Was there ever a time when you told Ben Fields that he wasn't allowed to use sheriff's department equipment or vehicle? And he says, I don't recall. I am having an episode. Sorry. Okay, should we take a break? And so they take another break. Um, she asks him, what did you do to train the deputy sheriffs um, on this policy? And he said, I gave them a copy of the policy and told them to read it and be familiar with it. Then she says, as we sit here today, is it your opinion that Ben Fields violated the provision of abusive position, of the policy related to abusive position while he was employed as a deputy sheriff? And he answers, what was the question again? Sorry, I was reading. I just, I don't get it. Um, just a second, I forgot to put my earphones in, so I'll be right back. Okay. Um, then she says, okay, I have not seen one of those before, talking about an identification card. On the second page, also under Section 7, violations of ethical standards, there is some reference to investigating ethical conduct violations. Have you ever investigated an ethical conduct violation as sheriff? And he says, ask me again? Sorry. Then she says, have you ever conducted an investigation of a violation of ethical standards since you have been sheriff? And he answers, I don't really get what you are asking me. I mean, this is insane. And if this is his norm, then why was he sheriff? Because he obviously isn't intellectually capable of being a sheriff. So I'm hoping that when he was elected sheriff, that he was more capable than he is showing signs in this deposition, because this deposition shows that he's not capable of running a town or a county. That's my opinion. She asks him if he ever investigated an ethical violation. He says he doesn't recall. Um, then she says, I'm in the same paragraph, violations of ethical standards that we have been looking at. And of course, his lawyer pipes up and says in paragraph 7, and Miss Baxter says correct. And the answer is, he said the appropriate authority, and she says, yeah, who is the appropriate authority if you know? And he answers, I would imagine that it would be me. You don't even know? um, she asks, does the Letcher County Sheriff Department conduct annual in-service training on ethics? He says, no, I give them the policy and tell them to familiarize their self with the policy. She says, is the Letcher County Sheriff's Department, do you have any kind of accreditation? He says, I don't recall. Now, mind you, he was still sheriff at the time of this deposition. These are things he should know as the sheriff, right? Am I wrong? She says, at any time since you have been sheriff, have you made any revisions or changes to the policies? And he says, I don't recall. Then she says, does the Letcher County Sheriff's Department conduct any annual in-service training whatsoever? And he says, on what? And she said, and she already said on whatsoever. And she says, on anything. Is there any Letcher County, specific Letcher County Sheriff's Department annual training? And he says it's the range training qualification, which is the shooting range. Um, she says, do you do any training on the Letcher County Sheriff's Department policies? He says, I don't recall. It's crazy. Um, um, she says it looks like this policy requires extra duty detail that the secondary employer themselves have to submit a permit application for approval through the Sheriff's Department. Would you agree with that? Which one are you reading? Um, Then she says extra duty detail. As I read this definition, it states performance of law enforcement duties not within regularly scheduled hours provided to any business person or enterprise. The services that East Kentucky Correctional Solutions provided included law enforcement duties, do they not? And he says, no, they do not. And she says, what kind of duties did they perform? And he said, they are just monitoring the people on house arrest and reporting back to the court. I would think that that's law enforcement duties, but apparently they don't consider it to be. So would you consider that to be police? She says, would you consider that to be police or not non-police natured? And he says that would be non-police. You don't have to be a police officer to do that job, because there was a lady before me that wasn't a police officer that done it. I mean, his English leaves a bit to be desired, for one. His grammar. And she says, can you give me examples of what the Letcher County Sheriff's Department, what kind of performance of duties would qualify its duties by its duty details? And he said it would be like security at the school ball games. Well, to me, that's law enforcement. And she says, okay, so is that the SRO position that you described previously, or is that different? And he said it, quote, could qualify as that. It says, okay, did the folks that wanted to hire Letcher County Sheriff's Department personnel for security at the ball games, did they submit an application for approval of a permit? He says, no. And she says, but under this policy, they were supposed to, correct? He says, I have verbal. She says, so you gave verbal permission to who? It don't happen often. One of the road deputies might help with the ball game, and they will pay. Under what policy? No, he says they will pay. And she says, who do they pay? And he says they pay the road deputy. But under this policy, they are supposed to pay the sheriff's department, who then pays the employee, correct? And he says, you got me bouncing around. Where are you talking about? I mean, it's just crazy. She says, what is another example of a law enforcement duty? And he says, none that I can think of. And she says, what about employment that is of a non-police nature? Can you give me an example of what that could be? And he says, Walmart, retail, gas station. And she says, where in your opinion does the EKC's CS fit between these different definitions for secondary employment? And he says the later, the second one, which it should be the latter. And she says, is it your testimony that working as a home incarceration officer with EKCS is work that provides no real or implied law enforcement services to the employer and is not performed during assigned hours of duty? And he says yes. She says, has the Letcher County Sheriff Department got an outside employment request form? And he says, we don't. Sheriff Webb didn't have one. He would do a verbal with me. She says, but you were the sheriff between 2019 and 21, correct? He says, yes. And this policy was in effect then, correct? And he says, yes. Um, She says this policy requires deputy sheriffs who have outside employment to submit a statement indicating that no aspect of the employment could be considered questionable in nature, such as placement in compromising situation, use of police powers, or have the potential to bring discredit to the department. Do you see that under the subsection D? And he said, you said D, right? And she says, do you see that? And he says, yes. She says, did you ever require Ben Fields to provide you with any such statement as provided for on that? And he said, not that I recall. Um, Shall not engage. Then she says, I'm looking at the second page now. A police officer slash sheriff's deputy shall not engage in sexual conduct with another person who is in the custody of law, as such officer has supervisory or disciplinary authority over such other person. She says, do you see that? He says, yes. She says, do you agree with me that Sabrina Atkins and Jennifer Hill, while they were on home incarceration, were they in the custody of law according to this policy? And he says, yes. And did Benfields have supervisory or disciplinary authority over them? And he says, yes. She says, what kind of specific training did the Letcher County Sheriff's Department provide in the time that you have been sheriff regarding this policy? And he says, none that I recall. And she says, do you believe that Benfields violated this policy? He said, yes, absolutely. She says, what is the internal affairs section for the Letcher County Sheriff's Department? He says, we don't have one. Is there anybody else with internal affairs responsibility within the Letcher County Sheriff's Department? He says, not that I recall. And again, he's still, during this deposition, he's still the sheriff of Letcher County. And he doesn't know any of these answers. Obviously, if this was his norm, he should never have been elected sheriff for obvious reasons. And if it's not his norm, then it should have been noticed as far back as when this was done, which I believe was in September. So I'm not understanding why nobody noticed something going on before the week before the shooting. And then she asks, did you terminate Benfields because of the violation of this policy? And he says, I would need to look at the termination letter. I mean, this is like right after it happened. Why would he have to look at it? Miss Baxter says Mr. Shaw says there's two versions, and she's the termination. And Mr. Shaw speaks up and says, no, there was two versions of the termination, which why there would be two versions of the termination, I couldn't tell you. The one that was the draft and the one from the county attorney had approved, and I am not really sure which is which. This, and she says, I guess this does specify that you violated or that you terminated Benfields due to his violation of certain policies. Was it just the ethic policy that is referenced? And he says yes. And she says, conduct unbecoming, and he says yes. Then she says, do you believe that Benfields also violated the sexual misconduct policy? And he says, absolutely. And she says, okay, then why didn't you say that in your termination letter? And he says, the county attorney, I got guidance from the county attorney. I sent this one down to him. He called me back and sent this one to use, and that is what he wanted. Then she says, subsection 10, conduct of unbecoming. I just want to clarify that I'm looking at the right thing. On the second page of that policy under X, conduct unbecoming, that is the provision that you terminated Ben Fields pursuant to. Is that correct? And Stines answers, that is the one that the county attorney recommended, yes. And Baxter asks him, well, did you agree with the county attorney's recommendation? And he answers, that is the one that the county attorney recommended. And she says, do you always consult the county attorney in employee terminations or disciplinary matters? And he says, yes. She says, why? Because they are the county attorney. They give legal guidance. I am not an attorney. And she says, okay, you don't have to be an attorney to discipline or terminate someone. Was that unique to the Benfield situation since he was facing a criminal investigation? Or did you do that in all instances is what I am trying to figure out. And he says that was unique in Benfield's because of the criminal theft, he says, which I don't know where the theft came from. Um, and he says, you are bouncing around on me again. I can't keep up. I mean, it's just insane how off he is. Um, um, okay, and she says, do you recognize this policy? And he says, yes. And she says, it looks to be a policy about how you address citizen complaints. My first question is, have you ever employed this policy to investigate any kind of citizen complaint to your recollection? He says, not that I recall. Have you ever been made aware, aside from the reporter who called you up to notify you about Ben Fields, can you think of any other situation where you were made aware of a complaint alleging employee or department misconduct? And he says, ask me that again. And so she asks him again, and he says, I have received nothing formal in writing, but the county attorney tells me if somebody wages a complaint to put it in writing. And she says, well, this policy doesn't require complaints to be in writing, does it? And I'm looking under procedure on the second page, sources of complaint. That does not require a complaint to be made in writing, correct? And he says that's correct. Um, um, What are you doing, babe? Okay. Um, mm, okay, so now they're talking about Benfield's specifically. And she says, was there any kind of investigation conducted by your office related to the allegations against him from late January, early February of 2022? And he says, no, I just took the initial information. And she says there was no administrative investigation. And he says, just what information that I got, I reviewed everything, everything, something, and then sent it to the county attorney. And he gave me advice on what I needed to do. The documentation of it is just this. Um, he says, you've got me bouncing back and forth again. Um, I'm trying to remember. I got a phone call from a reporter. I believe that I called Mr. Fields and told him what was alleged. And then after that happened, Judge Kraft and Robbie Kinzer come to me, come to my office and gave me some information. I am not sure on the details. With the county attorney. I believe that he actually came over to the office and Lashana Frazier was with me, the office manager. Um, 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 did you take any notes when you talked to the witness? And he says, no, I did not because I wasn't going to do the investigation internally. Um, 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 this policy is called the training directive. Was it in effect between 2019 and 22? And he says yes. And this policy identifies a number of high risk official high risk something tasks. Do you see that? And he says yes. And it provides that each member of an agency will receive an annual block of training on each of the high risk critical tasks identified. So, did the Letcher County Sheriff's Department itself provide any block of training on these high risk critical tasks? He says, not that I recall. Who would have provided the annual training on these high risk critical tasks? They all received the training by the state. And that is on an annual basis. And he says some is on an annual and some on every 2 years. That is the minimum of the state. Then she asks, did the Letcher County Sheriff's Department ever give annual block training on sexual harassment and external sexual misconduct by officers? He says, not that I recall. And let me remind you that he was still the sheriff of Letcher County during this deposition. So the fact that he can't recall is kind of unnerving to me. Do you know whether or not any of the state training included an annual block of training on sexual harassment? And he says, not that I recall. This says that all training shall be documented, and it references that each officer shall have a training file. So does each officer have a training file? And he says, yes, all of the training that they receive from the state is a file. They get a certificate from the state, they will have that. Then Mr. Shaw pipes in and says, a lot of times transcripts housed with the state. The state is who documents and keeps up with each officer because we have so much turnover with officers going to each agency. I don't know that we have got it, but we request the transcript if we don't have it. And she says, do you have any lesson plans or outlines for in-house training? He says, not that I recall. Then they take another break. Then she says, one quick thing, I saw this in what you produced. Looks like a sexual assault investigation policy that got enacted October of 2023. I don't want to make it an exhibit. I'm just curious if you recall that and what prompted you to enact that new policy. And he says, we model our policies by KACO. And she says, she repeats and he says, yes. She says, are you being represented under a reservation of rights to your knowledge? And he says, can you explain that a little more? And she says, I don't know if I can. She says, let's look at some Facebook exhibits that you have had a chance to look over. And he says, mine is all mixed up. Yeah, I have them in kind of a specific order. And he says, are you going to give me a new copy? Are you talking about? Yes. She says, did you use Facebook Messenger to communicate with deputy sheriffs about work-related matters? And he says, yes. she says, I think that you entitled this group Fat Boys. Do you see that? And he says, yes. And she says, why did you call it that? And he said, well, look at me. Um, they take another break. Um, 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 do you dispute that these were conversations that you had with Jason Eccles and Ben Fields back in June of 2021? He says, no, I don't dispute it. Um, um, I am looking at a page marked 1191. It looks like a naked policeman. It looks to be an image that Jason Eccles sent to you and Ben Fields on June 14th. Is that correct? And he says, yes. And she says, okay, and was your response to him sending that image, good morning, boys, LOL? And he says, yes. So you thought that was funny? And he said, yes. And she said, did you give him any kind of response to that image aside from LOL? And he says, not that I recall. I think that I asked him if he had court. Um, um, I mean, schedule. Okay, so you just went on talking about work. Yes. No. Mr. Shaw says, I think it is intended to annoy, embarrass, or harass this witness by using private messages and trying to get it into a public record. But we can take that up later if we need to. And she says, okay, the next one that I have got is the one marked 1218 at the top, and I will pass you a clean copy. And Mr. Shaw says, is that number 11? And she says, correct. So this also seems to be some messages between yourself and Fields and Jason Eccles. And he says, yes. And it looks like, Deputy Eccles and Deputy Fields are discussing some transports to Hazard. And he says, yes. And then then Ben Fields writes, I think they both like the same sex, though. Jason Eccles writes, um, I don't know what that says, like freaky sex. And Jason Eccles responds, hardcore. Were they discussing the sexual orientation or sexual proclivities of these persons who they are about to transport? And Stines says, I can't answer that. I don't know. And Miss Baxter says, well, you received the messages back in June of 2021. I don't know who they would be talking about if not the persons who they were about to transport. But I am wondering what your interpretation was when you read it. And he says, to be honest with you, I don't read a lot of these because they are so childish. If you will look at mine, I don't read a lot of them. I get a lot of messages that I don't even pay attention to. Then Mr. Shaw pipes up again and says, I object to the characterization. I mean, it is plain if they need to take 2 transport vehicles. What that has to do with anything, I don't know. And Miss Baxter answers, well, the record will speak for itself. Um, um, she says, is it appropriate for a deputy sheriff to discuss the sexual orientation or sexual proclivities of persons who they are transporting? And he says, absolutely not. She says, did Ben Fields or Jason Eccles ever get disciplined or reprimanded for having this conversation? And he asked, this certain one, I can't recall. Then there's some reference at the bottom, and Jason says, are we playing Sunday? And you wrote, don't know yet. Are you talking about playing poker? And he says, yes. Did you serve alcohol at these poker get-togethers? And he said, very rarely, but there's alcohol there from time to time. I don't drink a lot because I get called out where I am the sheriff. But now if I am out of town, yes, I will have an alcoholic beverage. This one looks to be some messages between yourself, Deputy Eccles, Deputy Norris, and someone with the last name of Bowling. Christine Bowling. Who is Christine Bowling? She's an employee of the office. Then it says, so it looks like Deputy Morris shares a screenshot that's sort of, by my read, making a joke about sexual arousal and Crown Victoria vehicles. Is that fair? And he answers that he had sent to his wife, yes. And then he shared it with you and his coworkers, right? And he says, yes. And she says, did you think that was an appropriate thing for him to do? And he says, I don't understand your question. And she says, was it appropriate for Deputy Sheriff to be sharing a message like this with yourself and his coworkers? And he says, to blow off some steam and make fun of each other, you know. So does that mean yes, it was appropriate? And he says, no, it was not appropriate. She says, did Deputy Norris receive any kind of discipline or reprimand as a result of this communication? And he says, I can't recall if it was on this one. And she says, has he ever been disciplined or gotten a reprimand? And he said, verbal, yes, often. So how many verbals do you get before it's written? So are you saying they have been reprimanded for this communication? And he says, I can't recall. Okay, let's look at the next one. This is the one marked 13. Yeah, looked at this one. Okay. At least based on these couple of pages, it looks like. Yeah, I googled it, and it's it says it looks like you sent him a photo. It is on the second page showing a building with a big sign that says Mouse's Ear. And he says yes. And she says, what is Mouse's Ear? And he says, it's a strip club. Have you ever been there? And he says, years ago, yes. She says, did you send that to your deputy sheriff because you thought it was funny? And he says, yes. Okay, this looks to me to be a conversation between yourself, Fields, Deputy Fields, and Deputy Eccles. Is that correct? Yes. And it looks like Jason Eccles sends an image with a joke referencing penis size. Is that accurate? Looking at the second page, and he says yes. And she says, okay. And then he writes, I figured this would be better here, LOL. Do you know what he meant when he said this would be better here? And he says, no, not that I recall. And she says, okay. And then you wrote to him that that was funny. Do you see that on the third page? And he says, is that coming from me? And she says, on the third page, yeah, it has got your name at the bottom. And at the top, it says, that was funny. And she says, I think that statement is attributed to you, but would you agree? And he says, that is funny, or that statement is attributed to me. And she said, did you say this in the chain, that was funny? And he said, yes. And she said, okay, and you were talking about the penis size joke that Deputy Eccles sent. Is that correct? And he said, that is what it says here. Then it says, this looks to be some communications between yourself, Deputy Eccles, and Deputy Norris. And he says yes. And she says, so it looks like first, the way that I read this, you sent a photo of like maybe a Greek statue, some sort of stone statue that is on the page marked 1698. And he says yes. And then later you sent another image where it looks like to be the same statue, but it has got your face, Deputy Eccles' face, and I believe maybe Deputy Norris's face. Is that correct? And he says yes. Do you know what you sent that image? Do you know why you sent that image to the deputies? And he said, for blowing off a little steam, picking on each other. And she says, how are you picking on them in this picture? And he says, Mr. Shaw pipes in again and says, continuing objection to relevance. And he answers, we are just aggravating each other. And then on the next page, marked 1700, you wrote, this is great at Ben Fields. Is that because Ben Fields photoshopped the faces on that statue for you? And he says, I can't recall. I think he is in the group with us, so it will be marked at Ben Fields, you know. Do you want me to... Oh, look, where James picture. Then she says, on the second page, there is an image. Is that an image that you sent to these persons who you supervise in the Letcher County Sheriff's Department? He says, yeah, that is what it looks like. And she says, whose face is that up there? And he says, Jason Eccles. And just to clarify, was he the person who also pictured Officer, I don't know what that says, Turtle's head on the last exhibit that we just looked at? And he says yes. She says, why did you send this to these people who you supervise? And he says, I thought it was funny. She says, and you wrote, and I am looking at 2040. You wrote, I was trying to be respectful, but that is funny. Were you referencing the image that you sent? And he says yes. And she says, what kind of example do you think that you were setting for the folks working under you by engaging in this kind of conversation with your sheriff's deputies? And he says, horrible. And she says, did those communications that we just looked through, did those violate any of the Letcher County Sheriff's Department's policies that we reviewed earlier? And he says, which ones? And she says, conduct. And and, and he says, yes. And she says, which ones? And he says, conduct. And she says, conduct unbecoming. And he says, acting professional too. And she says, at least after those communications we looked through, do you recall there being any discipline or reprimand resulting from any of these communications? And he says, no documentation. And she says, nothing documented, you're saying? And he says, that is right. So then they take another break. Then it says they would listen to a 5 or 6 minute audio recording of Brianna Cornett. And she says, okay, did you hear her twice reference her mother speaking to you about her issues with Ben Fields? And he says, yes. So, do you recall that Christy Foltz came to you and talked to you about Brianna Cornett's issue with Ben Fields? And he says, no, she has never come to me and talked to me about issues with Brianna. And she says, so it is your testimony that Christy Foltz never made that report to you. And he says, of sexual allegations. And Miss Baxter says, I think that was what I heard on the recording was that Christy Foltz went to you and said, I have to live in this town, but I know why he won't give it to her. Talking about putting Brianna Cornett back on home incarceration. And Sheriff Stines says, I don't recall that conversation with Miss Foltz. I don't recall. Okay, talk about another document here. I will give you a chance for you know. Then it says, in paragraph 5 of this affidavit, he states that on or about December 15th of 2021, he reported the sexual abuse of Jennifer Hill by Deputy Fields to the Letcher County Sheriff's Department by telephone and in person at your headquarters downtown. Do you see that? And he says, yes. And she says, so what did the Letcher County Sheriff's Department do in response to this report? And he says, we didn't receive no report from Mr. Triplett. So they're saying that they're not getting any of these reports. They're all lies. And she says, have you asked your staff about whether or not any such report was made back in December? And he says, yes. And she said, what response did you get? No one received any reports to that. Are you aware, on or about December 15th of 2021, Chris Triplett was pulled over by Deputy Norris for having a tinted license plate cover? Were you aware of that? And he says, I don't recall. And she says, is Deputy Norris a road officer? And he says, yes, ma'am. Let me see. Um, 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 she says it looks this looks like a criminal complaint that Benfield swore out. Is that correct terminology? And he says yes. And she says, I guess, would a sheriff's deputy need to come to you first before they swore out a complaint like this? And he says, I don't understand your question. She says, I was just wondering, like, is there some sort of process? If I am a deputy sheriff and I'm going to get a criminal complaint, do I have to notify the sheriff before I do that? Or was there any sort of, and he says, no. She says, deputies have full discretion to go and get criminal complaints without approval from the sheriff. Is that correct? And Mr. Shaw objects to the form of the question, and approval comes from the county attorney. Miss Baxter, okay, I was just wondering if he was involved in that process at all. Um, um, she says, if a deputy sheriff wants to go and get a criminal complaint, would the sheriff be aware? And he says, not at all times. And she says, okay, what would the circumstances be when you would be aware of that? And he says, if I am on the case. What does it mean to be on the case? If I'm working the case, if it is my case. Well, if it was your case, wouldn't you be the person to get the complaint? And he says, yes. And she says, okay, so if it is your case, would there ever be a situation where instead of yourself, a deputy would go to swear out the complaint? And he says, if he was a witness to it, he could go down. So this says the offender on home incarceration failed to report to the Letcher County Sheriff's Office. Do you see that? And he says yes. And Benfield signs this as, it says Benfield's LCSO. Do you see that? And he says yes. Is that the designation for Letcher County Sheriff's Office? Yes. So you're saying that he would have gone to speak to the county attorney about this complaint, and he would have worked with the county attorney to fill this out. Is that your understanding? And he says he spoke with the county attorney's assistant. So Angela Trent's signature down there at the bottom. Yes. She says that is one of my questions. Who is Angela Trent? And he says she's a secretary for the county attorney. Would you have been aware of the fact that the complaint warrant had been generated? And he says, no, it wasn't generated on the 15th. You looked at that wrong. She says, excuse me. She says, okay, help me. And he says the judge signed it on the 14th. And he says it says that date was printed, the copy. He says it was actually the judge signed it on the 14th, so it is actually should have been generated then in the computer system. And Miss Baxter says, but in this case, it looks like it was not generated until the next morning. Regardless, would the sheriff's department get a copy of this after the warrant is generated? And he says, no, ma'am. And she says, so what, if any, involvement with the sheriff's office have with this complaint warrant? It would go into a computer system. And I guess if the sheriff's department is the sheriff's department responsible for arresting people and serving warrants? And he says yes. So would you have been responsible for this warrant? And he says, we looked at them daily. I don't know if we are responsible for that one. And she says, okay, so the sheriff's department would have looked at this complaint warrant in the computer system? And he said, we look at complaint warrants in a computer system once the OA, the AOC and the e-warrant system. And she says, okay, is there one person at the sheriff's department who's responsible for reviewing all of that? And he says, no. She said, okay, so everybody has got access to it? And he says, everybody has access to e-warrants. And she says, are there only certain deputies within the Letcher County Sheriff's Department who have the authority to arrest people? And he says, depends on the location. She says, help me understand what you mean by that. And he says, road deputies can arrest on the road and, court and everything. Court security is supposed to be court on courthouse grounds. She says, okay, so Ben Fields only had the authority to arrest people in court and on courthouse grounds. Is that correct? And he says, yes. So she says, so is it fair or is it accurate to say that at least as of the morning of January 15th, everyone within the Letcher County Sheriff's Office would at least have access to be able to see this complaint warrant, correct? And he says, it depends something on what day it is. And she says, I see. That is a Saturday. And he says, yeah, nobody is at the office. I don't even have a deputy out on Saturday mornings. And she says, did you ever take issue? Do you ever recall reviewing this criminal complaint or complaint warrant? And he says, not to my knowledge. Um, mm, okay, and then it says, what do you recall them telling you? And she's talking about Judge Kraft and Robbie coming down to his office to talk to him about the Brianna and Sabrina lawsuit against Ben Fields. And he says, I'm trying to remember. They came into the office and told me that Ben had been fooling around with a drug court participant. He says Brianna Cornett, and that Stacey Yates had reported that he had been fooling with Sabrina Adkins. And that is when they mentioned something about messages. And she says, was that their term of our act fooling? Did they use that phrase? And he says, I can't recall. So they told you that Ben had been fooling around with Brianna Cornett and told you that Stacey Yates had reported that there had been some sort of fooling around between Ben Fields and Sabrina Atkins. Did I understand that correctly? And he says, yes. And she says, and that there are some messages. And he says, yes. Did they tell you that they had these messages? And he says, I can't recall. Did they tell you whether they reported it to anybody before reporting it to you? They advised me that they had not reported it to any law enforcement or anybody else. Okay, what about Judge Mullins? Do you think that he was aware? Did they tell you? Did they tell you? He says, no, they didn't tell me. And she says, okay, did you say earlier that they were apologizing to you? And he says, yes. Explain to me how they apologized to you. And he says, they just said that they were sorry that they didn't come and tell me when they first found out about it. And what did you say to them? And Stein says, yeah, you should have come and told me. I am the sheriff. I am the sheriff. You know that I am going to want to know that. And she says, can you think of anything else that was discussed in that meeting? And he says, not that I recall. Says, okay, it looks like the next thing that you did was tell me this was Frazier and Bowling a part of that meeting with Kraft and Kinser? And he says, no. It was just the three of you? And he says, yes. So then he says that the county attorney, he called the county attorney and told him about the allegations. The county attorney came to his office and he says, what did you guys discuss? And he says, just what some of the allegations were. Okay, and what was his advice to you? And he said the letter suspending without pay. Um, uh, why were you putting Ben Fields on suspension without pay? Because he has been messing around allegedly with drug court participant, another female. Aside from the folks that you have mentioned, as we have been reviewing this exhibit, mark number 20, was there anybody else that you consulted with about this decision to suspend Ben Fields without pay, aside from the folks you mentioned already? He says, not that I am aware. Did you ever instruct Ben Fields to delete any of his Facebook groups or messages? He says, no. Did you delete any of your messages with Ben Fields after these allegations came to light? Not that I am aware of. What did you say to Ben Fields? That the reporter had made some allegations and a lawsuit had been filed against him for sexual abuse. Did he respond to that? I can't recall what he said. Did he deny it? Did he admit anything? I can't recall at the time. Then it says, okay, before we get to the Ben Fields aspect, at 1816, I guess that is 626, someone whose name is blacked out came to your office. Do you remember who that was? And he says, yes. And she says, who was that? He says, Brianna. Was she in jail at that time? Did they bring her up from the jail? And he says, I can't recall. Did you call her up on the phone and ask her to come to your office, or how did she end up knowing to go there? I don't recall. Did anybody bring her there? He says, I can't recall. he says, did she come to your office at your request? He says, I can't recall. So she appeared at your office, and what was the conversation? She came into the office and sat down at the desk, and Lashana was there, and she came in and said Ben Fields had kissed her, I believe, in his car. Okay, did you make any notes or any kind of recorded statement of what she was telling you? And he says, no, I told her to give me her name and number, and I would have somebody contact her. Okay, you already knew her name, though. Yes, I had her write it down. I will try to find that. Okay, you think that you wrote that down. You say that you wrote down her name and number, but you don't recall making any notes about the substance, about what she told you. And he says no. And no one else was present for that conversation. And he says, yes, Lashana Frazier was there. Did that take place in your office or in the, and he says, in Lashana's area, out front, not in my office. Anybody else present in the office at that time? And he says, by that time, dispatch is gone. How long did that conversation last? And he says, just a few minutes. Um, Okay. It shows that Ben's wife has spoken to Lena Hensley about Sabrina Atkins' incident. Do you see that? And he says yes. And she says, so let's start there. Who is Lena Hensley? She's an employee at the jail. And Ben's wife, she's also an employee of the jail, right? And he says yes. Okay, so I guess Bert Sloan is calling you and relayed that information to you. Stein says, no, no, he came over to the office. Baxter says, okay, so what did he say when he showed up to the office? And Stein says that whoever investigated it needed to come over and talk to Ben's wife. Did you ask him, do you know anything more what what he told, what the wife told Lena Hensley beyond what is in here? And he says, I can't recall if he'd said. Do you know if anybody ever did go over to the jail to speak with Lena Hensley or Ben's wife? Stein says, I don't know. Have you ever spoken to Lena Hensley about these allegations, about this issue with Ben Fields? And he says, no. Have you ever spoken with Ben's wife about this issue? And he says, no. He says, so at the time that this all started happening, I was tore up and was having a bad episode. So my memory's fogged. I made this later just to kind of have some guidelines to go back. So you did make this sometime after February 11th, do you think? And he says, yeah, I think so. I don't know the exact date. We didn't put it on it. What was her? Do you think that Lashana Frazier would remember when this was created? And he says, I don't know. We're going to come back to this. Do you recognize this form? He says, yes. And he says, what is this form? Stein says, it is, we sent in to Kentucky Law Enforcement Council that. Just making sure that I am telling you right, okay? Um, um, She says, was there any administrative investigation here? And Stein says, just taking the information that I took here, speaking with the county attorney and the Commonwealth attorney. I have left the Commonwealth attorney off my timeline, and KSP refused, and that he would get up with the AG's office, and they told me that they would investigate it. I can't remember. My timeline here is bad because I had such a bad episode. I can't remember the details. Um, I guess if anyone performed an administrative investigation aside from yourself, who would that have been? And Stein says it would have just been me. And as far as the administrative investigation that you conducted, is it documented on this piece of paper marked Exhibit 22? And he says yes, mostly. What other documents might exist? I don't have any other documents, Stein says. Um, you decided to terminate Fields on the 22nd, is that correct? I've got a document here, and this is what was produced in discovery. But that is not quite descriptive as the other version that you came with today, correct? And he says yes. So which version did Ben Fields get? And he says the other one. Um, Says, then you said you talked to Judge Mullins. What did you and Judge Mullins talk about? I told him that a lawsuit and stuff had been filed. Did he not already know that? And he says, I don't know. Okay, well, was it your impression when you spoke to him that he was aware of that or was not aware of that prior to your conversation? And he says, I can't recall. She says, so what did you tell him? I can't recall our conversation. What did he tell you? I believe that I went over and told him that Ben wouldn't be there because I had to suspend him because of a lawsuit. I can't remember a lot of the details, because I was sick. So the conversation that you had, to the best of your recollection, you had at the courthouse, not in your office. And he says, I can't remember seeing him at my office. Okay, do you remember how long that you spoke to Judge Mullins? He says, no, I can't remember. Aside from that conversation that you had with Judge Mullins on February 1st, have you had any other conversations with Judge Mullins about Ben Fields and these allegations about sexual misconduct? And he says, I can't recall. Do you have any documents that would help refresh your recollection? You and Judge Mullins or any of these other persons, do you guys text? He says, yeah, I can check. Okay, I will ask you to do that. Anybody else that you recall speaking to on February 1st, aside from the Commonwealth Attorney, County Attorney, and Judge Mullins? I'm wondering why he felt the need to talk to Judge Mullins about this. Is it because he knew that Judge Mullins was also involved and he wanted to give him a heads up this is happening? So, walk a straight line, keep your shit in order, and don't do anything questionable for a while until you hear from me? I mean, why would he talk to Judge Mullins about it? Judge Mullins isn't, as far as I can tell at this point, is not involved in any of this. So, I'm not quite sure why Judge Mullins had to be brought in. You mentioned him, and you have got some notes about what Bert Sloan told you on the 2nd. When do you recall about what he told you or what you told him on the 1st? And he says, I don't recall. Okay, then. At some point on February 2nd, you handed Ben Fields his termination notice, which is the one marked Exhibit 6. And he says, yes. Okay, and so where did that exchange occur? It was outside the courthouse in the parking lot of the funeral home beside the courthouse. So he fired him in the parking lot? And how did you know that he was going to be there? I just seen his truck. Okay, so don't you have to have him sign paperwork and stuff for termination? It's really weird. Would you have put it in the mail, or how would you have gotten it to him? I would have called him and asked him to come in. So you saw his truck out there and you took this letter out to him, and what did he say? What did you say to him? It was an envelope. I handed it to him and said, this is your termination letter. Okay? And did you say anything beyond that? No, that was all that I said. Did he say anything to you? Not that I recall. Was that the first time that you have terminated someone from the Letcher County Sheriff's Office? And he says yes. So the next thing on your timeline notes jumps to February 10th. So is there anything missing that is relevant to Ben Fields and these allegations that occurred between February 3rd and February 10th when you have your notes here? And he says, I can't recall. So the next thing that you have on your timeline, at least, is on February 10th at 11 a.m., Judge Kraft contacted you and said Brianna had informed more information regarding Ben Fields. Do you see that? He says, yes. And she says, what was the more information? He says, I can't recall. He called me. I think he called my cell phone, I believe. About Trees Club. Do you know who that is? So that is it. Let me see. And then it has the reporter's, the stenographer's certification. Um, so I don't know. It sounds like if I got nothing else out of this, I think that ex Sheriff Stines was showing signs of mental capacity, loss of mental capacity, or some maybe even some psych issues as early as this deposition date. And they're saying that they noticed that he was acting odd a week up to 3 days before prior to the shooting. And I'm from after reading this deposition, have to I have to disagree with that. I have to say that I think that he was decompensating as far back as the deposition for the civil suit, and maybe even before that. Maybe it just became apparent during the civil deposition, but nobody noticed. It didn't strike anybody else as odd that he was so aloof and confused and bewildered and just lost. And if that's what happens when he's having an episode from his tick bite illness, then should he have been elected sheriff? If it happens under stress, especially, because I would think that being a sheriff is a very stressful job. I mean, am I wrong? I would think that being the sheriff of a county, small or large, would be a stressful job, a stressful position to hold. And if he has episodes that cause him to be confused and cause him to forget things and etc., then how can he be productive as a sheriff? Because 90% of what they do is going to be stressful, correct? I mean, they're a police officer. They're going to get called to crime scenes and accident scenes and, abuse cases. And I'm wondering how effective is he as a sheriff if he has episodes and shows these symptoms every time he gets stressed out. So, was he even competent to be sheriff? Is my question. Did nobody notice that he was acting a little altered mentally because this is how he always acts? And if that's the case, somebody dropped the ball on allowing him to be sworn in as sheriff, in my opinion. And I'm not saying anything bad or negative about him, but he obviously is not in the right mind, or in the right competency to hold a position such as sheriff for the county. And the fact that he was grandfathered in and he had no experience and he had no education background, it was just like an old mom and pop type situation where, oh yeah, this is so and so, he's my buddy, so let's make him sheriff. I mean, I realize it's a small county, a very small county, but don't they have regulations and stuff to follow? If you ask him, he doesn't know if there's regulations to follow or policies to follow, which is very scary. Because, like I said, at the time of this deposition, he was still the sheriff, and he couldn't recall anything about the policies, anything about the training, nothing. So, we're going to keep following the Stines case. Like I said, this was the civil case between Sabrina Adkins and that Sabrina Adkins brought against Ben Fields and Sheriff Stines and a few other organizations and a few other people. So, but I just kind of wanted to get some background on, because they're talking about how his deposition in the civil case could play a big part in his criminal case. And I wanted to see why they thought that. Well, it shows that he's very mentally decompensated, I think, if nothing else. So it'll be interesting to see how they want to bring this in, how they want to play it. But I don't think it shows insanity, but I definitely think it shows a diminished capacity to understand what's going on and to remember what's going on. And as a sheriff, that is a big red flag, I would think. So anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And I will see you guys later. Take care. Um, Stay warm, stay dry, stay healthy, stay safe. And I will see you on the next one. Bye.